and a process that should be very familiar to Americans who lived through the wars in Iraq, then Libya, then Syria, and now Ukraine. What was until very recently declared to be a loyal friend and partner could switch on a dime to be not only an enemy, but an enemy that we have always opposed, and vice versa. As Orwell wrote in that book using his protagonist Winston Smith, quote, "The party said that Oceania had never been in an alliance with Eurasia. He, Winston Smith, knew that Oceania had been in an alliance with Eurasia as short a time ago as 4 years ago. But where did that knowledge exist? Only in his own consciousness, which in any case must soon be annihilated. And if all others accepted the lie which the party imposed, if all records told the same tale, then the lie passed into history and became truth. Who controls the past, ran the party slogan, controls the future. Who controls the present, controls the past. And yet the past, though of its nature alterable, never had been altered. Whatever was true now was true from everlasting to everlasting. It was quite simple. All that was needed was an unending series of victories over your own memory. Reality control, they called it. In newspeak, doublethink. Thus did Saddam Hussein go from close American allies in the 1980s against Iran to incomparable Hitlerian evil who must be vanquished, including because he had gassed his own people. Indeed, an incredibly evil thing to do, albeit something he did when he was still a close U.S. ally with whom Donald Rumsfeld was shaking hands. The same thing happened with ally-turned-enemy Muammar Gaddafi of Libya when it came time for that regime change war, and the same thing with ally-turned-new Hitler Bashar al-Assad. It wasn't that our government and its media alleged that anything had changed. It was that everything just started being rewritten and revised to imply that nothing had changed, that it had always been this way. And we are seeing this propagandistic framework more vividly than ever in how Ukraine is now talked about in the West versus how they were discussing that country for the 8 years before Western populations needed to be convinced to send arms and massive amounts of their money there, even if it meant a proxy war or risking a direct hot war over Ukraine with a nuclear-armed power. To begin with, consider this documentary from the BBC in 2014. Its title assumed, as if it weren't debatable, that in fact it was a basic truth, namely many Ukrainians do not want to live under the rule of Kiev or even be citizens of Ukraine at all. Instead, they are Russian-speaking ethnic Russians whose families for centuries have self-identified as Russian, and they would much rather live under the rule of Moscow than Kiev, especially once the Ukrainian government was changed with the help of Victoria Nuland and her friends and became pro-EU instead of pro-Russian. Now, that may not be your choice if you lived in Ukraine. I can certainly understand when I hear Ukrainians, particularly those in the West whose first language is Ukrainian, say they'd rather have democratic autonomy and pick their own leaders than live under the rule of Moscow. But it doesn't matter what I want or what you want if you were in Ukraine. The indisputable fact of the matter is, as the Western media always acknowledge, a large number of Ukrainians, particularly in the eastern part of the country, would rather be annexed by Russia or at least be declared independent of Kiev. That is why, unbeknownst to so many in the West, since it now interferes with the preferred narratives, so many of them have, since the change of government in 2014, been fighting a civil war against the central authority in Kiev. They are separatists who are backed by Russia. Recall that when the Clinton administration's involvement in the war in Yugoslavia grew deeper and deeper, especially by the end of the 1990s, a central war demand of the U.S., like why are we involved in this war at all? The demand became that the province of Kosovo, which had long been part of Serbia and subject to the central rule of Belgrade, much like eastern Ukrainian provinces are subject to the central rule of Kiev, instead be declared independent. And the argument of the West was that the people of Kosovo did not want to be part of Serbia. And that was largely true. And so the US and NATO pressed the case until Kosovo won its independence. At the time, Vladimir Putin, who, with Russia as a long-term ally of Serbia, and someone who believed in the stability of the post-World War II order, warned that granting independence to Kosovo would be deeply destabilizing, since many provinces in Eastern Europe were shoved into countries with which they did not identify and from whom they wanted to be independent. But that warning was ignored. And thus, Putin decided to use that precedent, the one that gave independence to Kosovo, to justify the Russian invasion of Georgia in August of 2008, based on the argument, again, a true one, that the vast majority of people in those two Georgian provinces, South Ossetia and Ascabia, despised the Georgian president, someone who had been selected by and was beloved by American neocons, and were demanding Russian passports and citizenship instead. And the same thing happened in 2014 when Russia held a referendum in Crimea, and over 90% of the citizens of that province voted in favor of becoming part of Russia. Now, there are valid criticisms of how that referendum was conducted, given that Crimea still had Russian troops on its territory when the voting was held, but nobody seriously doubts that the vast majority of the people in Crimea identify as Russian and prefer to be ruled by Moscow than by Kiev. Close to 85% of people in Crimea speak Russian as their first language, while only 3% speak Ukrainian. And the same is true, and has long been true, of people in the provinces of eastern Ukraine, including in the Donbass region. But how often do you hear that admission now from Western media outlets? Almost never. To listen to them, all Ukrainians are the victims of Russian aggression because they crave their sovereignty and their democratic government in Kiev. But that's just false. A large minority of Ukrainians, and a majority of them in Donbass, want to be part of Russia or to be independent. And that's what makes that BBC documentary so fascinating, is that it uttered this truth in unflinching form, and even sent a reporter to eastern Ukraine to interview the people in that region about why they want to be part of Russia or are very hostile to the central government of Kiev. Watch the BBC.
Oleg wants to show me some videos that he says are making him and people here really, really angry. This is, he says, what we are seeing on Russian TV. And his family is really interesting because unlike most people that we talk to at demonstrations, pro-Russian demonstrations in Donetsk and Lugansk, they watch Ukrainian television as well as Russian TV, and they say that they are making a very conscious choice and here to be with Russia, and here is why.
Вот это не сепаратизм.
Это школа, да?
Это школа киевская. Это
Олег,
дети.
нормально разговаривай. Олег.
Тише.
They're shouting, hang the Russians, hang the Russians. So he says, and now, and you're telling me we're the separatists, we're the bad guys?
Повесить русского это.
How do you think that makes us feel?
Олег, вот если Россия...
You may have noticed he told his wife to be quiet while he was speaking. That wasn't very nice, but he was expressing a view held by, as the BBC admitted, a large number of Ukrainians in the East. And that is why, for all the talk about how a diplomatic solution is impossible, one solution has always been clear. Hold a fair and free election or referendum in those provinces, supervised not by Russian forces but UN peacekeeping and other forces, and allow the people of those regions to decide for themselves what they want their fate to be, using the precedent of Kosovo and the independence granted to it by the West. What the BBC said and showed in 2014 was not controversial at the time because it's undeniably true. But now anyone pointing out that many Ukrainians prefer to be part of Russia would be instantly accused of being a Russian propagandist, and you'd be hard-pressed to find such admissions in any Western outlet. It's been all declared off-limits. Now, the question of what people in eastern Ukraine want is by far not the only topic where everything has changed. Let's take a look at the hero's welcome that President... Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.